Montana, September 1918. The evening light fell golden across the Montana ranch, painting the weathered boards of the cabin in shades of amber and rust. Nathaniel Bridger sat in his rocking chair on the front porch, hands folded over the knob of his walking cane, watching his grandson pack a canvas duffel bag inside through the open door. Thaddeus was 17, tall and lean, like his grandfather had been at that age, with the same steady hands and quiet way of moving through the world. The boy would leave at dawn for the train station. From there, Chicago. Then a ship across the Atlantic to France, where men were dying in trenches filled with mud and poison gas. The Great War had been grinding on for 4 years now, and it seemed determined to swallow every young man it could reach. Thaddeus emerged from the cabin, the duffel slung over one shoulder. He sat down on the porch step beside his grandfather's chair, silent for a long moment. The Bitterroot Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of autumn. "Grandpa," the boy said finally, "were you ever scared? Scared you'd have to choose between staying alive and doing what's right?" Nate didn't answer immediately. He looked out toward those mountains, their shapes familiar as the lines of his own palms. 40 years he'd lived in their shadow. 40 years since everything had changed. "Let me tell you about the winter of 1878, he said, "when I met a woman whose prayers were more dangerous than my rifle ever was." The old man's voice settled into the rhythm of memory, and the present moment faded like smoke. Montana Territory, December 1878. The forest was silent in the way only deep winter woods can be, when the cold presses so heavy that even the wind holds its breath. Nathaniel Bridger moved through the snow like a ghost, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. He was 36 years old, lean and hard, from 15 years in the mountains, dressed in buckskin and wool that had long since faded to the color of bark and stone. He'd been tracking the elk for 2 days. A big bull, 8 points at least, moving alone through the high country. Good meat for the winter and a hide worth trading. The tracks led him deeper into the pine forest, where the snow lay thick and untouched except for the delicate prints of small animals. Then he heard the wolves, not the usual hunting howls that echoed across the ridges at night. This was different, higher pitched, more urgent, the sound of a pack that had found something and were fighting over the claim to it. Nate stopped cocking his head to listen. The sounds came from the west, maybe a quarter mile through the trees. He should have kept tracking the elk, should have minded his own business. The mountains taught a man to look after himself first, and everything else could go hang. But something in those wolf cries made him change direction. Maybe it was the feeding frenzy pitched to them. Maybe it was just the fact that he hadn't heard another human voice in 3 weeks, and some part of him was hungry for proof that other people still existed in the world. He moved toward the sound, the Sharps rifle held ready across his body. The .50 caliber could drop a grizzly at 100 yards. Wolves wouldn't be a problem. The trees thinned ahead. Through the gaps between the trunks, he saw movement, dark shapes circling something pale. As he got closer, the scene came clear. 5 wolves, big gray timber wolves with winter coats, thick and silver. They moved in a loose circle around the base of a tall pine tree, their attention fixed on something at the trunk. Steam rose from their open mouths. Their eyes caught the late afternoon light and threw it back like polished stones. Then Nate saw what held their focus. A woman knelt in the snow at the base of the pine, her wrists bound behind her to the trunk with leather cord. She wore a black dress, heavy wool with a white collar visible at the throat. The remains of a white coif hung torn around her shoulders, a nun's habit, or what was left of one. Snow had gathered on her shoulders and in the folds of her dress. Her face was pale, lips going blue from the cold, but her eyes were open and alert. She didn't scream, didn't struggle. She knelt there in the snow, watching the wolves circle closer, and the only movement Nate could see was the steady rise and fall of her breathing. The wolves were getting bolder. The nearest one crept forward, hackles raised, testing how close it could get. Another few minutes and they'd be at her throat. Nate raised the Sharps, sighted on the lead wolf, and fired. The rifle's boom shattered the frozen silence like a sledgehammer through glass. The lead wolf dropped mid-stride, dead before it hit the snow. The others scattered, instantly vanishing into the trees with startled yelps. The echo of the shot rolled away through the forest and faded. Nate reloaded as he walked forward, the practiced motions taking maybe 8 seconds. By the time he reached the tree, he had a fresh round, chambered and ready. The woman watched him approach. Her eyes were gray, he noticed, the color of winter scammon. He pulled a skinning knife from his belt, a 10-inch blade he kept sharp enough to split hairs. "Hold still," he said, and cut through the leather binding her wrists. The moment the cord parted, she pitched forward. Nate caught her before she could fall face first into the snow. She weighed almost nothing, all bone and cold flesh beneath the heavy wool. Her whole body shook with tremors she couldn't control. "You're safe now," he said, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. She looked up at him. Her lips moved, trying to form words, but nothing came out at first. Then in a voice rough from the cold, and something else, something harder than fear, she said, "The wolves were only doing what wolves do. The men who tied me here knew better." Nate blinked. That wasn't what he'd expected. No thank you. No tears or hysterics. Just a simple statement of fact delivered in a tone that suggested she'd already accepted death and found it less frightening than the men who'd put her here. "Ma'am," he said, "we need to move. They'll regroup once they get their nerve back." She nodded, tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately. Nate caught her again, then simply lifted her in his arms. She was light as a child, though he could see she was a grown woman, maybe 25. He carried her to where he'd left his pack horse 20 yards back in the trees. Getting her into the saddle was awkward. Her hands were too numb to grip and her legs wouldn't support her weight. He ended up climbing up first, then pulling her up in front of him, settling her sideways across the saddle like cargo. She didn't protest, didn't lean back against him for support. She held herself upright through sheer will, spine straight, even as the shivers racked her body. Nate turned the horse north, away from the tree and the dead wolf. As they rode, he felt her clutch something against her chest beneath the black wool of her habit. Something small and hard that she guarded even in her half-frozen state. A leather pouch or bag of some kind. He didn't ask about it. A man's business was his own in the mountains, and he supposed the same courtesy extended to nuns. They rode in silence. The light was fading fast the way it did in winter, the sun dropping behind the mountains and taking all warmth with it. The temperature would hit 20 below zero by midnight, maybe colder. They needed shelter and fire, and they needed both soon. But as they crested a small rise and the pine tree fell behind them, Nate glanced back one more time. The moonlight was coming up silver and clear, and in that light he could see the scene more clearly. The way the leather cord had been tied, the height at which it bound her to the tree, exactly 4 feet off the ground, high enough that wolves could reach her, low enough that she couldn't climb or slip free, and the knots themselves visible now in the snow where he'd cut them away. Military-style Prusik knots, the kind cavalry soldiers used for securing prisoners. This hadn't been some random act of cruelty by passing raiders. This had been calculated, measured. Someone had positioned her at that tree the way a hunter sets bait for a trap. The question was whether they'd been trying to kill her or draw out whoever might try to save her. Nate turned back to the trail ahead, jaw tight. Either way, he was involved now. And men who tied nuns to trees for wolves weren't the type to let witnesses walk away. Nightfall, he found shelter in a rock hollow he'd used before, a deep notch in a granite outcropping that blocked the north wind and had enough overhang to trap heat from a fire. He got the woman down from the saddle and into the hollow, then went about the business of making camp. The temperature was already dropping hard, his breath frosted in thick plumes. The woman sat where he'd placed her, back against the rock wall, knees drawn up, shaking so hard her teeth chattered, loud enough to hear 10 feet away. Nate built the fire fast using dry pine from deadfall he'd cached here on a previous trip. The wood caught quick flames leaping up, orange and bright. Heat rolled out into the hollow, pushing back the killing cold. Only then did he turn his attention back to the woman. He pulled a spare wool blanket from his pack and draped it over her shoulders. She pulled it tight, but the shaking didn't ease. That was bad. Meant the cold had worked deep into her core. He dug out a strip of jerky in his canteen. "Drink," he said, holding the canteen to her lips. She drank one small swallow, then another, then stopped, pulling back. He tried to press it on her again. "You need more than that. I take only what I must." Her voice was steadier now, warmed by the fire and the water. It was an odd thing to say. Most people, half frozen and half starved, would drain the canteen dry. But she rationed herself like someone who'd been taught that supplies were precious and waste was sin. He offered the jerky. She took it, bit off a small piece, chewed it slowly, ate maybe half before wrapping the rest and setting it aside. Nate watched her, reassessing. This wasn't some sheltered convent woman who'd gotten lost in the woods. This was someone who knew how to survive. The question was where she'd learned it. He pulled cloth strips from his saddlebag, the kind he used for wrapping wounds after field dressing game. Her wrists were torn raw where the leather cord had cut in blood, dried dark against the pale skin. He dampened the cloth with water from the canteen and reached for her hands. She didn't pull away, just extended her wrists, watching him work with those steady gray eyes. He cleaned the wounds as gently as his rough hands allowed, wiping away the dried blood and dirt. She winced once when he touched a particularly deep cut but made no sound. He wrapped both wrists in clean cloth, tied them snug to stop any bleeding. "You've got grit," he said. "Most women would have screamed themselves raw back there." "Screaming feeds the wolves," she said. "Silence keeps you breathing." The words landed heavy, not a casual observation, a philosophy learned through hard experience. Nate finished tying off the bandages and sat back on his heels, studying her face in the firelight. What's a sister of mercy doing 80 miles from any church? Serving where mercy costs something. Costs your life, seems like. Better than keeping it for nothing. She met his eyes when she said it, and Nate saw something there that reminded him of men he'd known in the mountains. Men who'd chosen this hard country deliberately because easy living somewhere else would have hollowed them out from the inside. "You got a name?" he asked. "Sister Margaret Brennan. Most call me Margaret." She paused. "Or they did when there were people around to call me anything." "Nathaniel Bridger, Nate." She nodded once, filing it away. Then her gaze drifted to the darkness beyond the fire, and for the first time he saw something like weariness cross her face. "How long were you at that tree?" he asked. "Since morning. They tied me at dawn." 14 hours, in this cold. Nate felt his jaw tighten. 14 hours was a death sentence even without the wolves. "Who were they?" Margaret's hand moved to the leather pouch hidden beneath her habit. Her fingers pressed against it, confirming it was still there. "Men who want something I have. Men who will kill any who tries to keep it from them." "And what is it you have?" She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something behind those gray eyes. Then she shook her head. "Best you don't know. Best you leave me at the nearest settlement and ride on, knowing will only make them hunt you too. Might be they're already hunting me. I shot one of them wolves. Tracks will lead back to where you were tied, and if they set you there as bait, they'll want to know who took it." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Recognition that he was right. That the moment he'd cut her free, he'd stepped into whatever deadly game she was caught in. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be. I made my choice." The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. The temperature continued to drop. Nate added more wood, building up the flames. They'd need the heat through the night. He divided out more jerky for both of them, and they ate in silence. When the meal was done, Nate pulled his own blanket tight and settled back against his saddle rifle across his lap. Margaret lay down near the fire, the blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon. "Get some rest," Nate said. "We'll figure out where to go in the morning." But neither of them slept. Not yet. The night was too cold, the danger too close. They sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moan through the pines. Then from somewhere out in the darkness came a sound that froze them both. Not wolves this time. Something bigger, deeper, a rhythmic breathing, heavy and steady, the crack of brush being pushed aside, and beneath it all a low rumbling that vibrated in the chest more than the ears. Nate's hand went to the sharps. "Don't move," he whispered. The breathing got closer. Nate could hear the crunch of snow under massive weight, something circling the hollow maybe 30 yards out, testing the air. Then it stepped into the firelight. The grizzly was enormous, 900 pounds at least, shoulder hump rising higher than a horse's back. Its coat was thick and dark silver, tipped in the moonlight. Claws, 4 inches long, scraped the frozen ground as it walked. Steam rolled from its nostrils in great clouds. The bear had smelled their camp, smelled the jerky and the horse and the warm blood of living things. It moved closer, head swaying side to side, small eyes gleaming in the firelight. Nate raised the sharps. At this range, maybe 15 feet, the .50 caliber would punch clean through the bear's skull. But the beast was so close that even a killing shot might not stop it before it reached them. A dying grizzly could cover 15 feet in under 2 seconds and tear a man apart with its last breath. His finger curled around the trigger. He sighted on the spot between the bear's eyes. One shot. That's all he'd get. Then Margaret stood up. Nate's heart lurched. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer, didn't look at him. She rose slowly, every movement deliberate and careful. The blanket fell away from her shoulders. She stood in her torn habit, small and fragile looking, in front of the massive animal. The bear stopped. Its head swung toward her. Margaret reached into the folds of her habit and pulled out her rosary. The wooden beads gleamed in the firelight. But she didn't pray. Instead, she began to hum. It was low and rhythmic, a sound that came from deep in her chest. Not a hymn, not Latin, something older, a droning chant that rose and fell in waves, creating a vibration Nate could feel in his own bones. The grizzly's ears pricked forward, its head tilted, curious. Margaret kept humming the sound steady and unafraid. She didn't back away, didn't challenge. She simply stood there, making herself present, establishing her existence in a way that carried no threat but demanded acknowledgement. Nate recognized the rhythm. He'd heard it before years ago from Salish hunters. A death chant, they'd called it, used when honoring game they'd killed or when facing their own deaths. A sound that said, "I see you, I respect you, I am here." The bear took another step forward, then another, close enough now that Nate could smell it, the rank musk of its winter den still clinging to its fur. Margaret didn't flinch. The humming continued steady as a heartbeat. The grizzly lowered its massive head, sniffing the air around her. Its breath stirred the torn edges of her habit. For 10 eternal seconds it stood there so close, it could have killed her with one swipe of its paw. Then it huffed a sound almost like dismissal and turned away. It walked around the edge of their camp, investigating the horse that packs the perimeter. Found nothing worth the effort. With a final grunt, it lumbered back into the darkness and was gone. The silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. Margaret lowered her hands, the rosary disappearing back into her habit. She swayed slightly, and Nate realized she was shaking again, but not from cold this time. She sat down carefully, pulling the blanket back around her shoulders. Nate lowered the rifle, his own hands trembling faintly. What in God's name was that? "The Salish women at the mission taught me," Margaret said, her voice quiet but steady. "They said animals respect the voice that doesn't lie. Fear sounds different from respect." The bear heard respect. "The mission," Nate repeated. "You lived with the Salish. At St. Catherine's Mission in Ruby Valley. 7 years now. The tribe there, they took me in when I first arrived. Taught me their language, their ways. The diocese didn't approve, but Father Donovan said if I was going to serve their people, I needed to understand them." Nate added wood to the fire, processing this new information. "So you're not just a nun, you're something else too." "I'm a bridge," Margaret said, "between their world and mine. Or I was before." She trailed off her hand, moving again to that leather pouch hidden in her habit. "Before what?" She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Wind moaned through the pines. Finally she spoke. 2 weeks ago, armed men came to St. Catherine's. 6 of them led by a man with a territorial judge's writ. They said we were trespassing on railroad land, that the mission had to be evacuated. Father Donovan tried to show them our deeds, our legal claim. They shot him, twice in the chest. He died on the chapel steps. Her voice didn't waver, but Nate heard the weight beneath the words. The grief held in check by iron will. The other sisters fled. But Father Donovan, in his last moments, he gave me something. Made me promise to run, to get it somewhere safe. Somewhere the truth couldn't be buried with him. She pulled the leather pouch from inside her habit. It was small, maybe 8 inches long, sealed with a cord. Even in the firelight, Nate could see how carefully she held it. "This is what they want," she said. "This is why they left me for the wolves, and this is why they'll keep hunting until they get it, or I'm dead or both." "What's in it?" Margaret looked at the pouch, then at Nate, weighing trust against danger, measuring whether telling him would save his life or doom it. "Land deeds," she said finally, "the real ones, and maps, and a signed confession from a territorial surveyor named William Grimes. Together they prove that the Northern Pacific Railroad has been stealing land through fraudulent deeds. 50,000 acres, maybe more. They bribed judges to validate false claims. They paid church officials to look the other way. And when people tried to fight back, they sent men with guns." She opened the pouch just wide enough for Nate to see inside. Rolled parchment, multiple sheets with red wax seals and official-looking signatures. The kind of documents that could hang powerful men if they ever saw the inside of a courtroom. The Salish families who lived on that land, Margaret continued, they were driven onto reservations. Settler families too. People who'd homesteaded legally, they were evicted at gunpoint. All so the railroad could lay track through valleys they had no right to touch. Father Donovan collected proof, every deed, every survey map, every piece of evidence. He kept it all in a safe in his office. That's what they were looking for when they killed him. Nate reached out slowly, touching one of the documents. His finger traced across a signature at the bottom. Judge Thomas Wardell, Territorial Court of Montana. The date read March 1807. This name hit him like a fist to the gut. He knew that name, knew it better than he wanted to. Wardell, he said the word tasting like ash. Margaret looked up sharply. You know him. I know his son. The fire popped. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled and others answered. The same pack from earlier regrouping still hunting. His son, Margaret said carefully. Is he? A bounty hunter. Used to be my partner back when I was trapping, before everything went to hell. Nate stood up, too restless to sit. He paced the small, hollow mind racing. Jacob Wardell. It had been 8 years since they'd crossed paths, 8 years since Nate had let him live when he should have put a bullet in between his eyes. And now here it was, the past coming back like bad meat. If these documents implicate Judge Wardell, Nate said, then his son will be the one leading the hunt. He'll have money behind him. Railroad money. He'll have men. And he won't stop until he gets what he's after. Then you should leave me here, Margaret said. Take the horse ride north and don't look back. I'll make my own way. You won't last 2 days out here alone in winter. I'll last as long as God wills. But you don't have to die for me, Mr. Bridger. Nate stopped pacing, looked at her across the fire. This small woman in her torn habit holding documents that could topple judges and railroad barons, talking about dying like it was just another chore to be done. My father used to say something, Nate told her. He said a man holds ground or loses soul. I spent a lot of years not understanding what he meant, but I'm starting to figure it out. And what ground are you holding here? The kind where a woman doesn't get left to wolves, the kind where truth matters more than money. That ground. Margaret studied his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy something. She nodded once. Then, we ride together. But you should know what that means. They'll burn everything you have to smoke us out. They'll turn every lawman in the territory against us. And when they catch us, they won't make it quick. Noted. You're a strange man, Mr. Bridger. So I've been told. She smiled then, just a flicker, there and gone. Get some rest. I'll take first watch. You're half frozen and exhausted. And you carried me 5 miles and saved my life twice in one day. Sleep. I'll wake you in 3 hours. Nate wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at him now that the adrenaline had faded. He stretched out by the fire rifle cradled in his arms and closed his eyes. Sleep came fast, but it wasn't restful. He dreamed of wolves circling in the snow, of grizzlies with eyes like cold fire, and of Jacob Wardell's face twisted with rage and grief, promising vengeance for sins 8 years old. Dawn. Nate woke to gray light and the smell of snow coming. Margaret sat where she'd been when he fell asleep, wrapped in the blanket, watching the trail that led into their hollow. Her face was pale and drawn, but her eyes were alert. Anything? He asked, sitting up. Not yet, but they're out there. How do you know? She pointed to the snow at the edge of their camp. Fresh tracks, horse tracks, 3 sets. They ran in a wide circle around the hollow, never coming close enough to be seen, but close enough to confirm their quarry was still here. Nate cursed under his breath. The tracks were maybe 2 hours old, judging by the frost forming in the depressions. Whoever had made them had passed in the deepest part of the night when both he and Margaret should have been asleep. He knelt beside the tracks, studying them. 3 horses, heavy riders, well supplied. The hoofprints were deep and evenly spaced, no signs of exhaustion or poor shoeing. Professional mounts, not range ponies. They tracked us here, Margaret said. Followed our trail from the tree. Yeah, and they didn't attack because they're not sure what they're dealing with yet. They know someone took you. They don't know if it's 1 man or a dozen. Don't know if I'm a trapper or a territorial marshal. So they're watching, waiting to see what we do. What do we do? Nate stood, brushing snow from his knees. We run, fast and far. I've got a cabin about 2 days north, hidden valley most folks don't know about. We can ford up there, figure out our next move. They broke camp quickly, burying the fire and scattering the ashes. Nate saddled the horse while Margaret gathered what little they'd unpacked. Within 20 minutes, they were moving, heading north through the forest. The snow started an hour later, big wet flakes that fell thick and fast, covering their tracks almost as soon as they made them. Good for hiding their trail, bad for visibility and footing. They pushed hard through the morning, stopping only once to rest the horse and eat more jerky. The landscape rolled past in shades of white and gray pine forests, giving way to more open country, then back to trees again. Nate navigated by landmarks he'd memorized over 15 years, a lightning-struck snag here, an oddly shaped boulder there. By midday, they'd covered maybe 12 miles. The snow eased off, leaving the world muffled and pristine. Nate was starting to think they might actually make it to the cabin without trouble. Then Margaret went rigid behind him. "Stop," she said. He reined in. "What is it?" She slid down from the horse, landing in snow up to her knees, and moved forward. Knelt down, studying something Nate couldn't see from the saddle. "Tracks again," she said. "Fresh." "Very fresh." Nate dismounted, came to look. More hoof prints, the same 3 horses from last night. But these were different. These didn't circle. They led straight ahead on a direct line with the route Nate had been taking. His gut went cold. "They know where we're going." "How can?" "Jacob Wardell knows these mountains almost as well as I do. We trapped together for 3 years. If he's leading this hunt, he knows about my cabin. Knows I'd head there if I was in trouble." Margaret looked up at him. "They're not following us. They're ahead of us. Hurting us, yeah." The implications settled over them like the snow. They couldn't go to the cabin, couldn't go anywhere Nate was known to use. Every bolt hole, every cache, every shelter he'd built in 15 years of living in these mountains, Jacob would know about them all. "We need a new plan," Nate said. Before Margaret could answer, smoke appeared on the horizon, a thick black column rising into the gray sky maybe 5 miles ahead, right where Nate's cabin should be. They'd already burned it. Margaret's hand found his arm. "I'm sorry." Nate stared at the smoke. 15 years of his life going up in flames. His winter supplies, his furs and traps, the books he'd collected over the years, the few personal things he'd kept from his time before the mountains. All of it ash. "Don't be," he said, and his voice came out harder than he'd intended. "They lit the match, not you." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. They'd burned his cabin because of her, because of what she carried. And they'd keep burning until they got what they wanted. The question was how much more he was willing to lose before he gave it to them. Movement caught his eye. Someone stepping out of the tree line ahead, maybe 100 yards distant. A man on foot, hands raised, rifle slung across his back in a posture of surrender. Nate raised the sharps. "That's far enough." The man stopped. He was older, maybe 45, dressed in buckskins gone dark with grease and wear. A beaver hat sat askew on his head, and a gray beard covered most of his face. "Easy, Bridger," the man called. "I ain't with Wardell." Nate kept the rifle level. "Then what are you doing out here, Porter?" Henry. Porter, former Army scout turned railroad tracker. Nate knew him by reputation, and none of it good. Porter was the kind of man who'd track his own mother for the right price. "Trying to save your fool neck," Porter said. "You gonna shoot me, or you gonna listen?" Nate kept the sharps trained on Porter's chest. At this range, the 50 caliber round would punch clean through and out the other side. Porter knew it too. He stood very still, hands raised to shoulder height, not moving. "Talk fast," Nate said, "and it better be good." "Wardell's got 6 men with him," Porter called. "They're camped 2 miles east of your cabin, waiting to see if you show. But that ain't the worst of it. There's a second crew coming from Helena. Federal marshals, 4 of them, dispatched by Judge Thomas Wardell himself. They'll be here by tomorrow morning." Margaret stepped forward close enough that Nate could feel her presence at his shoulder. "Why would you tell us this?" "Because I helped put you in this mess, sister, and I got debts to balance." "Come forward," Nate said, slow. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Porter walked toward them through the snow, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who knew one wrong move would get him killed. When he was 20 feet away, Nate gestured with the rifle barrel. "That's close enough. Now explain." Porter's weathered face looked older, up-close line deep from years in the elements and harder things than weather. 2 weeks back, railroad bosses hired me to track a dangerous criminal. Said she was a nun who'd murdered a priest and stolen church property. They offered $200. That's a fortune for a man like me. And you believe them, Margaret said. Her voice carried no accusation, just flat statement of fact. I did. Tracked you from Ruby Valley to where Wardell's boys set that wolf trap. I watched them tie you to that tree. Porter's jaw worked. And I rode away. Told myself it wasn't my business. A job's a job. But here you are, Nate said. Here I am, because I couldn't sleep after. Kept seeing your face, sister. The way you didn't scream. The way you just knelt there waiting to die. Porter looked down at the snow. I've done bad things in my life, things that way. But leaving you to the wolves, that was a new low, even for me. Margaret studied him with those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to bone. What did you do? Followed at a distance. Cut Wardell's saddle girth one night while they slept, cost him half a day when it broke. Spooked their pack horses, another night scattered their supplies. Stole ammunition from their camp when they got drunk. Small things. Enough to slow them down, give you a chance. And now you want absolution, Margaret said. No, sister. I want to help you finish this. Those documents you're carrying, they prove what I already know. The railroad's been stealing land for years. I've tracked families for eviction crews. Watched children cry when soldiers burn their homes. I got paid well for it, but I'm done being that man. Nate lowered the rifle slightly, though he kept it ready. What do you know about the marshals? They're not coming to arrest her. They're coming to kill her. Judge Wardell's orders. No trial, no witnesses. Just make it clean and bury the evidence. The words fell heavy. Margaret's hand moved to the leather pouch hidden in her habit, protecting it instinctively. There's more, Porter continued. Wardell's put out wanted posters. $300 for the sister dead or alive. Murder of Father Donovan, theft of church funds. Every trapper and drifter from here to Idaho will be hunting you before the week's out. Nate felt the situation closing in like a trap. They couldn't go north to his cabin. It was burned. Couldn't go east. That's where Wardell was camped. Couldn't go south to any settlement they'd be recognized from the posters. And federal marshals were coming from the west. We're boxed in, he said. Not quite. Porter pulled a folded map from inside his coat, spreading it on a flat rock. There's one route they won't expect. Hell's Canyon coming in from the east side. It's rough country near Suicide in winter. But it leads to Bannock. There's a newspaper there, the Territorial Times, editor named Samuel Blake, honest man. Get those documents to him, he'll print the truth. Once it's public killing, you won't bury it. Bannock's where the railroad has the most influence, Margaret said. Why would we run straight into their territory? Because that's exactly why they won't expect it. Wardell thinks you'll run for the territorial capital or try to reach a telegraph office in Idaho. He's got men positioned for those routes. Bannock's the one place he figures you're too smart to go. Nate studied the map. Hell's Canyon was a narrow gorge that cut through the mountain's walls 200 feet high, in places floor barely wide enough for a horse and rider. In summer, it was dangerous. In winter, it was a death trap. One wrong step and you'd fall to the frozen creek bed below. But Porter was right. If they could get through it, they'd come out 5 miles from Bannock with no one expecting them. It's a gamble, Nate said. Everything is now, Porter replied. But it's a gamble with a chance. Staying out here in the open, you're dead by tomorrow. Margaret looked at Nate. What do you think? He thought about his burned cabin, about the smoke still rising on the horizon. About Jacob Wardell and all the old debts between them. About this woman who'd stood face to face with a grizzly and made it back down through nothing but will and strange wisdom. A man holds ground or loses soul, he said. The words came out without thinking, his father's voice echoing in his own. We go to Bannock, but Porter, you put 1 foot wrong, make one move that smells like betrayal. I'll drop you where you stand. Fair enough. Porter folded the map. We should move now. Wardell's scouts range wide. The longer we stand here talking, the better chance they spot us. They rode hard through the afternoon, Porter leading the way on his own horse, a rangy bay that looked half-starved but moved with surprising endurance. The route took them east, first away from the smoke of the cabin, then south in a wide arc that would bring them around to the canyon approach. The land opened up as they rode pine forest, giving way to high meadows buried under snow. The sky stayed gray and heavy, threatening more weather. Nate kept scanning the ridges for movement, for the telltale signs of riders trailing them. So far, nothing, but the feeling of being watched never left. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat. Porter shared his supplies, dried venison and hard biscuits that tasted like sawdust but filled the belly. Margaret ate sparingly again, the same careful rationing she'd shown before. "How long have you been at St. Catherine's?" Porter asked her. "7 years. I came west from Chicago when I was 18. Chicago's a long way from Montana territory." "It is, but I wasn't called to comfort, Mr. Porter. I was called to serve where it costs something." "Well, you found the right place for that." They finished eating in silence. As Nate prepared to mount up again, Porter caught his arm. "There's something you should know about Wardell. He's not just doing this for the money or because his father ordered it. It's personal for him. Personal with you." "I know." "Do you know why?" Nate's jaw tightened. "That's old history. Old history's got a way of coming back when you least want it. The men you ride with should know what they're riding into." Margaret was watching them both now, sensing the weight of something unspoken. Nate looked at her, then at Porter, then out at the empty white landscape stretching in all directions. "Tonight," he said finally, "when we make camp, I'll tell it then." They rode on. The afternoon light faded early the way it did in winter, and they found shelter in a cluster of boulders that blocked the wind. No fire tonight. Too dangerous. They'd be cold, but alive. As the three of them huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets against the bitter night, Nate felt the past pressing close. Memories he'd spent 8 years trying to bury rising up like ghosts in the darkness. Porter passed around a flask of whiskey. Margaret declined, but Nate took a long pull. The burn helped a little. "All right," Porter said quietly. "I'll ask it straight. What happened between you and Jacob Wardell?" The question hung in the cold air. Margaret sat very still, waiting. Nate took another pull from the flask, buying time. But he knew he couldn't avoid this forever. If they were going to ride together into Hell's Canyon, they deserved to know what kind of demons might be waiting on the other side. "We were partners," Nate began. His voice came out rough, not used to telling this story. "Best friends even. Met in '68, started trapping together. Made good money those first years. Survived winters that killed tougher men. I trusted Jacob with my life, and he trusted me with his." He paused. The memories were coming faster now, clear as yesterday. "Autumn of '70, we were at a trading post in Missoula. That's where I met Little Elk." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Little Elk. Salish woman, 22 years old, daughter of a tribal elder. She worked at the post as an interpreter, helped translate between the tribe and the white traders. She was beautiful, kind, spoke perfect English. And both of us fell for her hard." Nate's hands tightened on the flask. "She chose me. I don't know why. Maybe because I learned some Salish tried to understand her people instead of just using them. Maybe just because. But she chose me, and we married in a Salish ceremony that December." "And Wardell," Porter prompted. "Left. Said he understood, said he wished us well. On the surface, everything seemed fine between us. But I could see it eating at him. The bitterness, the sense that I'd taken something that should have been his." The wind moaned through the rocks. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. "I built a cabin, the one they just burned. Little Elk and I, we lived there. July of '71, she gave birth to a daughter. We named her Sarah." Nate's voice cracked slightly on the name, the first real emotion breaking through. "She had her mother's eyes, dark like creek water, laughed at everything, called me Papa Bear." Margaret's hand moved as if to touch his arm, then stopped, hovering in the space between them. "Sarah was 2 years old when it happened, February 14th, 1873. The date came out with the precision of something carved into stone. Winter had been hard that year. Little Elk took Sarah to visit her mother's family at their winter camp about 10 miles from our cabin. I stayed behind to check trap lines." He drank again, a longer pull this time. "That same winter, Northern Pacific Railroad executives approached Jacob. They offered him $800 to guide eviction crews to Salish winter camps. The railroad claimed the land belonged to them, said the tribe were squatters who needed to be removed before spring construction started." "$800, Porter breathed. "That's a fortune." Jacob took it, led 12 soldiers and 4 railroad enforcers straight to the camps. They arrived at dawn on Valentine's Day. The commander was drunk, had been drinking all night. He gave the order to clear the camps. They didn't mean evacuate. They meant burn. The words came harder now, each one pulled up from somewhere deep and dark. They set fire to the teepees while people were still inside. Little Elk ran out holding Sarah in her arms. A soldier shot her. Not a warning shot. Aimed and fired. The bullet went through her back and out her chest. Sarah fell into the snow. Margaret made a small sound, quickly suppressed. Sarah was crying, covered in her mother's blood. Another soldier shot her. Said later he was finishing it quick, being merciful. Nate's voice had gone flat, empty of inflection. She was 2 years old, and Jacob Wardell stood there and watched it happen. Didn't pull a trigger himself, but he'd led them there. He knew what they were capable of, and he did it for $800. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. I was 10 miles away checking traps. I heard the gunfire, distant but unmistakable. By the time I got back to the camp, the soldiers were gone. I found Little Elk first. Her eyes were still open. Her hand was reaching towards Sarah like she'd tried to crawl to her in her last moments. Nate's breath shuddered in then out. I found Sarah 3 feet away. She died alone in the snow. Margaret's eyes were wet firelight reflecting in tears she didn't let fall. I spent 2 days burying them, dug through frozen ground with my hands when my shovel broke. Then I tracked the eviction crew. Took me 11 days. When I found them, I killed 4 men. The soldiers who'd pulled the triggers. Clean shots from a distance. I wasn't trying to make them suffer. I was just trying to balance the scales. And Wardell, Porter asked quietly. Found him with the 5th man. Soon as I saw him, I knew. Knew he'd been there, knew he'd led them. He tried to explain, tried to say he didn't know Little Elk would be at that camp, didn't know what the soldiers would do. Said it was business, just business. Nate's hand tightened on the rifle across his lap. Then he said something that made me want to put a bullet in his skull. He said it was my fault. Said if I'd never married her, never brought her into the white man's world, she'd still be alive. Like her death was punishment for my choice, not his. What did you do? Margaret asked. I shot, aimed for his feet, bullet hit maybe 2 inches from his boot. Told him to get out of Montana and never come back. Said if I ever saw him again, I wouldn't miss. You let him live, Porter said. I did, and I've regretted it every day since. Because he was right about one thing. I did bring Little Elk into danger. I did make choices that led to her death. And for 8 years, I've lived alone in these mountains trying to make peace with that. Trying to figure out if there's any way to earn back what I lost. Margaret spoke, then her voice soft but firm. You didn't kill them, Mr. Bridger. You didn't pull those triggers. The guilt is Jacob Wardell's to carry, not yours. Tell that to the ghosts I see every night. I will if they'll listen. She met his eyes across the small space between them. But I think maybe Sarah wouldn't want you buried in guilt forever. I think maybe she'd want you to stand for something again. To hold ground that matters. The phrase echoed what he'd said before. A man holds ground or loses soul. Nate looked at this small woman in her torn habit carrying proof of corruption that could topple judges and railroad barons refusing to back down even when it meant her death. You remind me of her, he said. Little Elk, not in how you look, but in that fire, that refusal to kneel. Then honor her memory by standing with me. See this through. Nate nodded slowly. The weight of the past didn't lift, but it shifted somehow, settled into a shape he could carry differently. Now Wardell's hunting another woman I'm protecting, he said, and this time I won't fail. A man holds ground or loses soul. This is my ground. They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, exhaustion pulled them under, and they slept in shifts, 2 awake while 1 rested. The night passed slow and bitter cold, but morning came eventually gray and heavy with the promise of snow. They broke camp before dawn and rode hard for Hell's Canyon. The route Porter led them on was treacherous, winding through narrow defiles and across exposed ridges where the wind cut like knives. But they made good time, and by mid-morning they'd reached the eastern approach to the canyon. Nate reined in at the edge, looking down. The canyon was a crack in the earth, narrow and deep walls rising sheer on both sides. A thin trail ran along the northern wall, barely wide enough for a horse. Below 200 feet down, a frozen creek bed waited to catch anything that fell. "That's the path," Margaret asked. "Only way through," Porter said. "Used to be an old Salish hunting route, but it's been abandoned for years. Too dangerous. And we're sure Wardell won't expect this. He knows about it, but he also knows Nate's too smart to risk it in winter. Or at least that's what he'll think." Nate studied the canyon, calculating risks. One wrong step by the horse, one patch of ice on that narrow trail, and they'd all go over. But behind them, Wardell's crew was closing in. Ahead, federal marshals were riding from Helena. This was the only gap in the net. "We go single file," he said. "Porter first, me in the middle, Sister Margaret at the rear. If anyone starts to slide, the others hold position. Don't try to help, you'll just bring us all down." They began the descent. The trail was even narrower than it had looked from above, and slick with ice in places where water had seeped from the rock and frozen. The horses moved carefully, testing each step. Nate could feel his mount trembling beneath him, fighting its instinct to panic. They were halfway through the canyon, the walls rising high on both sides and the frozen creek bed far below when the first shot rang out. The bullet sparked off the rock wall inches from Porter's head, showering him with stone chips. He threw himself flat against his horse's neck as more shots followed, the reports echoing like thunder between the canyon walls. Nate looked up, riders on both rims of the canyon, 6 of them positioned with rifles. They'd been waiting. Somehow they'd known. "Ambush!" Nate shouted, pulling the sharps from its saddle scabbard. But there was nowhere to take cover on the narrow trail. They were pinned exposed with a 200-foot drop on one side and sheer rock on the other. Margaret's horse reared in panic. She held on with desperate strength, but the animal's hooves slipped on the icy trail. For one terrible moment, Nate thought both horse and rider were going over. Then Margaret regained control, hauling the horse's head around, forcing it against the rock wall where the trail was widest. More shots hammered down. Nate returned fire, the sharps booming. His bullet took one rider in the shoulder, spinning the man backward. But there were too many of them, and they had the high ground. Porter fired his Colt revolver upwards, 6 shots in rapid succession. One attacker ducked back from the rim, but the reprieve lasted only seconds. Then Jacob Wardell's voice echoed down, amplified by the canyon walls. "Nathaniel Bridger, longtime old partner." Nate's blood went cold. He'd known Jacob would be leading the hunt, but hearing his voice after 8 years brought everything back. The rage, the grief, the memory of Sarah's small body in the snow. "You're pinned, Nate," Jacob called. "Send out the sister and Porter, and maybe you walk away from this." Nate looked at Margaret. She met his eyes and shook her head once. No surrender. He hadn't expected anything else from her. He raised the sharps and fired at Jacob's position. The bullet struck close enough to make the man duck. "Come take her yourself, you murdering coward." Laughter rolled down from above, dark and bitter. "Still got that righteous anger. Good. I've missed it." More shots rained down. One struck the trail between Nate and Porter, sending ice and rock fragments flying. The horses were on the edge of panic now, eyes rolling white. Then one of the attackers on the west rim, a young man, maybe 19 years old, shouted to the rider beside him, "This ain't right. We're shooting at a woman." "She's $300, the older rider snapped back. "She's a nun. My mama would skin me alive if she knew I was doing this." "Your mama ain't here, boy. Now shut up and shoot." But the young rider didn't shoot. Instead, he turned his rifle on the older man and fired at him in the air. The older rider went down hard, tumbling from his horse. Chaos erupted on the rim. The other attackers turned, unsure who was shooting who. 2 more riders opened fire on each other as old grudges and moral panic broke through the veneer of professional discipline. Margaret seized the moment. She stood in her stirrups, holding the leather pouch high overhead so all could see it. "These papers prove 30 families were robbed." Her voice carried clear and strong, filling the canyon. "You're killing for thieves who'll pay you nothing when this is done." One of the remaining attackers froze, staring down at her. His rifle slowly lowered. Jacob Wardell roared in fury, "She's lying. Don't listen to her." But it was too late. The crew was fracturing. One rider threw down his gun and spurred his horse away from the rim. Another followed. The moral foundation of what they were doing had cracked, and men were choosing conscience over coin. Jacob fired his revolver at Margaret. The shot went wide, but only barely. Nate's return shot was faster and truer. The bullet grazed Jacob's arm, drawing blood. Jacob staggered back from the rim. "Cowards!" Jacob screamed at his fleeing men. "You'll crawl back to me, all of you." But they were already gone. Within moments, only Jacob remained on the rim, and he was bleeding alone. His careful ambush turned to chaos by a nun with a leather pouch and the courage to speak truth under fire. Jacob fired once more, wild and angry, then retreated. His voice echoed back one final time. "This isn't over, Bridger. I'll see you in hell." Then silence broken only by the sound of hoof beats fading in the distance. Nate lowered the sharps, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Margaret sagged in her saddle, the pouch clutched tight against her chest. Porter was breathing hard, Colt revolver still trained on the now empty rim. "Everyone intact?" Nate asked. "Alive," Porter confirmed. "I'm unhurt," Margaret said, though her voice shook slightly. They continued through the canyon, moving faster now, despite the danger of the trail. Speed mattered more than caution. They needed to be out of this death trap before Jacob regrouped or the marshals arrived. The canyon floor rose gradually as they progressed, the walls lowering until finally they emerged onto open ground. 5 miles to the south, visible through gaps in the trees, lay the scattered buildings of Bannack. They stopped to rest. Porter dismounted and checked the trail behind them. "I don't see pursuit. We might have actually shaken them." "Don't count on it," Nate said. "Jacob won't quit. Not when his father's name is in those documents. Not when I'm involved." They watered the horses from a small stream, letting the animals recover from the terror of the canyon crossing. Margaret sat on a fallen log, the leather pouch in her lap, staring at it like it was both treasure and curse. "3 men are dead because of she said quietly. "Maybe more from the ones who shot each other." "3 men made their choice," Nate replied. "Same as we made ours." "Does it get easier carrying that weight?" "No, but you learn to carry it different. Learn to use it as fuel instead of letting it burn you up." Porter returned from his scouting. "Canyon's clear behind us, but there's something you should know. While I was up on that ridge, I saw riders coming from the west. 4 of them with federal badges, visible even at a distance. The marshals are here." Nate cursed. They'd escaped one trap only to ride toward another. "How long until they reach Bannack?" Margaret asked. "Tomorrow morning, maybe sooner if they push hard through the night." "Then we move now. We get to Blake's newspaper office, hand over these documents, and he prints the truth before the marshals can stop us." "And if Blake won't help," Margaret stood, slipping the pouch back inside her habit, "then we find someone who will. But we don't stop. We don't hide. We stand in the light and make them kill us in front of witnesses if that's what they choose." Nate looked at her, this small woman who'd faced wolves and grizzlies and rifle fire without breaking, and felt something shift in his chest. The same thing he'd felt when Little Elk had defied convention to marry him. The same thing he'd felt when Sarah had looked up at him with complete trust. Love, maybe, or something close to it. The recognition of a soul that matched his own in ways he couldn't explain. "A man holds ground or loses soul," he said. "We go to Bannack together." Porter spat into the snow. "You're both mad, but I'm in. Might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb." They mounted up and rode toward Bannack. The afternoon light slanted golden through the trees, painting the snow in shades of amber. Behind them, Hell's Canyon stood like a monument to the gauntlet they'd survived. Ahead, the town waited, full of unknown dangers and uncertain allies. But they rode together, 3 unlikely companions, bound by choice and circumstance, carrying truth that could topple empires if only they could keep it alive long enough to speak it. The smoke from Bannack's chimneys rose into the winter sky, dark columns against the fading light. They were 2 miles out when Porter suddenly reined in hard. "Something's wrong," he said. "What?" "Too much smoke. And it's black, not gray. That's not cook fires." They pushed the horses faster, covering the last 2 miles at a gallop. As Bannack came into view, Nate's stomach dropped. The newspaper office, Samuel Blake's Territorial Times, was burning. Fresh flames licked at the walls, black smoke pouring from the collapsed roof. A crowd had gathered in the street, watching it burn, but no one was fighting the fire. They were too late. The railroad had moved first. Margaret's hand tightened on Nate's coat. They knew we'd come here." Porter's face had gone pale. Blake. Where's Blake? They rode into town, drawing stares from the gathered crowd. Nate spotted the body immediately. Samuel Blake lay in the middle of the street, 20 feet from his burning office. Shot twice in the chest. A wanted poster was nailed to his shirt. Margaret's face crude but recognizable. $300 reward. The marshal's deputy stood nearby, a fat man named Boyd, who Nate recognized from previous trips to town. Boyd's hand rested on his pistol, and his eyes locked on Margaret the moment they rode up. "That's her," Boyd said loudly. "The nun. She's wanted for murder." Townspeople turned staring. Some began backing away. Others moved closer, hands on weapons, seeing $300 on a horse. Nate kept the sharps ready, though he knew firing now would just get them all killed. They were outnumbered 50-1, and this crowd was turning hostile fast. Then Margaret did something that stopped everyone cold. She dismounted, walked straight toward the courthouse steps at the end of the main street. Her torn habit flapped in the wind. Her hair, uncovered now after losing her coif days ago, streamed behind her. She climbed the courthouse steps, turned to face the crowd, and pulled the leather pouch from inside her habit. "My name is Sister Margaret Brennan," she called out, her voice carrying clear into the cold air. "And I did not murder Father Donovan, but I know who did." She opened the pouch and pulled out the documents, held them high so all could see the official seals, the ribbons, the unmistakable stamp of legal authority. "These are land deeds, the real ones. They prove that the Northern Pacific Railroad has been stealing land through fraud. 50,000 acres from Salish families, from settlers, from anyone who stood in their way. They bribed judges to validate false claims. They paid church officials to stay silent. And when Father Donovan tried to stop them, they murdered him." The crowd murmured, uncertain. This wasn't what they had expected from a wanted criminal. Deputy Boyd started forward. "You're under arrest for murder and theft. Put down those papers and come quiet." But a huge man stepped between Boyd and the courthouse steps, a blacksmith by the look of his leather apron and soot-stained hands. 6'4", 250 pounds of muscle. "Let her finish," the blacksmith said. Boyd's hand tightened on his pistol. "Move aside or I'll arrest you too. Then you'll have to go through me." A miner joined the blacksmith, then a settler woman with a baby on her hip, then more. One by one, townspeople stepped forward, forming a human shield around Margaret and the courthouse steps. Margaret began to read. Her voice rose strong and clear, filling the winter air with words that carried the weight of proof and witness. And somewhere on the edge of town, Jacob Wardell watched from the shadows, bleeding, and alone his careful plans unraveling. Like rope in fire, the final confrontation was coming. But for now, in this moment, truth had a voice, and people were listening. Margaret's voice carried across the town square, clear and unwavering despite the cold that turned her breath to white clouds. She stood on the courthouse steps like a prophet calling down judgment, the leather pouch open in her hands, documents held high for all to see. "Land deed transfer, October 18th, 1875. She read, her voice ringing out. "Judge Thomas Wardell transfers Salish Reservation Parcel 14 to Northern Pacific Railroad Company. Signed witnesses. Bishop Clarence Moore, Senator Daniel Hayes. Purchase price $1 and services rendered." The crowd pressed closer. Shopkeepers abandoned their stores. Miners emerged from saloons, drinks forgotten. Women with children gathered at the edges, faces hard with memories of their own losses. These were people who knew the taste of injustice, who'd been told their evictions were legal, their suffering necessary for progress. Now they were learning it had all been lies. Margaret's fingers traced across another document. Father Donovan's journal, dated November 2nd, 1878. "Today I watched soldiers burn Mary Whitebear's cabin. She had 3 children under 5 years old. When I asked Bishop Moore why the church didn't intervene, he showed me railroad stock certificates. He said business is God's work too." A woman in the crowd sobbed openly. An old settler spat into the frozen mud. The blacksmith's massive hands clenched into fists that could crush stone. Deputy Boyd pushed forward, his fat face flushed red. "This is a legal assembly. You're obstructing justice." "What justice?" The blacksmith's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "The justice that murders priests, that burns families out of their homes while judges pocket railroad money." Nate stayed mounted, the sharp's rifle balanced across his saddle, eyes scanning the crowd's edges. Porter had taken position near the courthouse steps, Colt revolver visible at his hip. They both knew Jacob Wardell was out there somewhere wounded and desperate, planning his final move. Margaret continued reading. Document after document, real survey maps showing families living on land the railroad claimed was empty. Signed confessions from territorial surveyors admitting they'd falsified boundaries for pay. Letters from railroad executives discussing how much it would cost to bribe which judges. Judge Thomas Wardell's name appeared again and again. So did Bishop Moore's, Railroad Vice President Harrison Grant, Senator Daniel Hayes. A conspiracy of power and greed woven through every level of territorial government. The crowd's mood shifted from confusion to understanding to rage. A miner stepped forward, voice shaking. My claim, they said it was on railroad land, showed me documents with official seals. I thought it was law. It wasn't law, Margaret said. It was theft dressed in legal language. More voices rose. Story after story of stolen land, burned homes, shattered lives. The crowd swelled to over 200 people, anger building like pressure in a boiler. Then came the sound Nate had been waiting for. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving at speed. Jacob Wardell appeared at the far end of Main Street. He rode a black horse, his left arm hanging useless and blood-soaked from Nate's earlier shot in the canyon. But his right hand held a Colt revolver, steady. 5 men flanked him hard, looking riders with desperate eyes. Men who'd sold their souls so many times they'd forgotten the original price. That woman is a murderer, Jacob's voice cracked across the square. She killed Father Donovan. I have a federal warrant, Deputy Boyd, arrest her, or I'll do it myself. The crowd wavered. A federal warrant carried weight. These were people trained to respect authority even when that authority had betrayed them. But the blacksmith didn't move. Neither did the human wall around Margaret. She kept reading. Survey map dated March 18, 1876, shows actual boundaries of Salish Reservation. Railroad claimed this land was unoccupied territory. This map proves 43 families were living here, signed by territorial surveyor William Grimes. Lies. Jacob spurred his horse forward. His men followed. Those documents are forgeries, church property stolen by a criminal. Nate urged his mount into the street, placing himself between Jacob and the courthouse. The sharps came up, smooth and natural muzzle pointed at Jacob's chest. 30 yards separated them. An easy shot. That's far enough, Jacob. The entire square fell silent, 200 people holding their breath. Every eye fixed on the 2 men facing each other across frozen mud and 8 years of grief. Jacob's face twisted with pain and fury. Blood dripped from his sleeve, pattering onto his saddle. You took everything from me, Bridger. Everything. The woman I loved. My good name. My father's respect. My place in the world. And still you stand in my way. You killed my family for $800. Nate's voice came out cold and flat. Don't talk to me about loss. She chose you. The words exploded from Jacob like poison from a lanced wound. Little Elk was mine by right. I saw her first. Loved her first, I would have given her everything. But she chose a rough mountain man who smelled like beaver pelts and lived in a shack. Nate felt the old rage rising but kept it leashed. She wasn't property to claim. She was a woman who made her own choice, and you couldn't live with not being chosen. So you murdered her. I didn't pull the trigger. You guided soldiers to her camp. You took railroad money, knowing what they'd do. You stood there and watched my daughter bleed out in the snow. 2 years old, Jacob. She was 2 years old, and then you let them shoot her. The crowd stirred, horrified. This was more than a legal battle now. This was something primal and terrible, old wounds reopening in public. Jacob's revolver shook in his hand. It was your fault. If you'd never married her, never brought her into the white man's world, she'd be alive. This is on you. No, Nate's voice cut like a blade. This is on the man who sold his soul for coin and spent 8 years trying to convince himself it was someone else's sin. This is on you, Jacob. It's always been on you. Jacob raised the revolver, pointing it past Nate toward Margaret, his face contorted with rage and something deeper, the desperate fury of a man who knows he's already lost everything. If I can't have peace, Jacob screamed, if I can't have redemption, then nobody gets truth, nobody gets justice. His finger tightened on the trigger. 3 shots cracked simultaneously, the sound merging into a single thunderclap that echoed off the buildings. Nate's sharps boomed the .50 caliber round, catching Jacob high in the shoulder and spinning him sideways in the saddle. From the rooftop of the general store, Henry Porter's Winchester barked a bullet, punching through Jacob's chest from the side. And Deputy Boyd, reading the moment and choosing survival, fired his shotgun. The buckshot spread caught Jacob's leg and lower body. Jacob Wardell tumbled from his horse. He hit the frozen street hard, revolver clattering away across the ice. Blood spread beneath him, dark and steaming in the cold air. His 5 riders froze, hands dropping to their weapons, but not drawing. They found themselves surrounded by 200 armed townspeople. The math was simple and final. They raised their hands slowly, one by one. Nate dismounted, walking toward where Jacob lay. The sharps still trailed smoke. His boots crunched in the frozen mud. The crowd parted silently, letting him through. Jacob was still alive, but barely. Blood bubbled at his lips with each shallow breath. His eyes found Nate's face and held there. "You," Jacob's voice came wet and thick. "You should have let the wolves have her. Should have walked away." Nate knelt beside the man who'd been his best friend, his partner, before bitterness had poisoned everything between them. For just a moment, he saw past the murderer to the boy Jacob had once been. The friend who'd pulled him from a frozen river. The partner who'd shared whiskey and stories around 100 campfires. "I'm done walking away," Nate said quietly. "A man holds ground or loses soul. I chose my ground." Jacob's eyes widened slightly, as if understanding something for the first time. Or maybe just seeing death approaching. His breath rattled once, twice, then stopped. Nate stood slowly. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just the hollow emptiness that comes when vengeance turns out to be a meal that fills nothing. Margaret's voice rose again from the courthouse steps, still reading, still speaking truth to power. The crowd turned back to listen, though many glanced at Jacob's body, at the spreading pool of blood, processing what they'd just witnessed. Porter climbed down from the rooftop, Winchester smoking. He caught Nate's eye across the street. A nod passed between them, the kind that said, "We did what needed doing. We'll carry the weight together." Jacob's 5 men were being herded toward the jail by deputized citizens, the blacksmith leading them with a grip that brooked no resistance. Deputy Boyd had vanished, probably searching for somewhere to hide before questions about his shifting loyalties grew too pointed. Margaret held up another document. Signed confession of William Grimes, territorial surveyor, dated October 19, 1878. Her voice remained steady, though Nate could see her hands trembling slightly. "I hereby confess that I falsified survey maps at the direction of Harrison Grant, Vice President of Northern Pacific Railroad. I was paid $5,000 to redraw reservation boundaries and declare occupied land as empty territory. 43 families were evicted based on my lies. Witnesses saw me burn the original maps. I can no longer carry this weight. May God forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself." She lowered the paper. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the blacksmith spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "My family was on that land, 3 generations. Judge Wardell himself told us the eviction was legal, showed us papers with territorialty seals. We lost everything. My father died that winter, froze to death, because we had no shelter." A miner stepped forward. "Same here. Lost my claim last spring. They said the survey showed it was railroad property. I thought it was law. Thought I had no choice but to leave. A settler woman with a baby on her hip. They burned our cabin while my children watched. Called us squatters. My husband tried to fight, tried to show them our deed. They shot him. Left him bleeding in the dirt while they torched everything we owned." More voices joined a chorus of grief and fury. The crowd understood now. Understood that their suffering hadn't been necessary or legal. That powerful men had stolen from them and hidden behind false authority. Margaret held up the leather pouch, now nearly empty. "These are the real deeds, the real maps, the truth Father Donovan died protecting, and I'm giving them to you, to the people they were stolen from. This is your proof, your weapon against those who robbed you." A new voice cut through the crowd, old and hard and carrying absolute authority. "You'll give them to no one, sister." The crowd parted like water. Judge Thomas Wardell emerged flanked by two hired guards with rifles. He was 64 years old, gray-haired and distinguished-looking, in his black wool coat and silver watch chain. A man who'd spent 40 years building an empire of influence and wasn't about to let a nun with papers tear it down. He walked with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences, who'd signed documents that destroyed lives and slept soundly afterward, who believed his position made him untouchable. "I am a territorial judge," Wardell announced, his voice carrying practiced authority. "Duly appointed by the governor and confirmed by the territorial senate, those documents were stolen from church property. They belong to the diocese, not to this woman." Margaret descended the courthouse steps, walking straight toward him. Small and dirt-streaked in her torn habit, but her spine was steel and her eyes burned with righteous fire. "Your son just died in that street," she said, her voice cutting clear. "Died trying to kill me. Died trying to bury the truth about what you've done. How many more bodies will you stack to protect your corruption?" "Your Honor," Judge Wardell's distinguished facade cracked slightly. "My son was a troubled man. His actions don't reflect on these legal proceedings. Now surrender those documents or I'll have you arrested for theft, murder, and inciting to riot. On what authority your signature is on half these deeds? You sold land you had no right to sell. You took bribes from railroad executives. You validated fraudulent surveys. You are the corruption, Judge Wardell. You're the disease, not the cure." The crowd pressed closer, hostile energy building. These were people who'd been evicted under Wardell's signed orders, who'd lost homes and livelihoods because this man valued railroad stock over human suffering. Wardell's composure began to fracture. "You're speaking to a representative of territorial law. I can have you hanged for these accusations. Then hang me here in front of all these witnesses. Let them watch how your justice works. Let them see what happens to people who speak truth in your territory." One of Wardell's guards shifted nervously, sensing the crowd's mood. The other's hand moved toward his rifle, but Nate was already there, sharps leveled at the guard's chest. "I wouldn't," Nate said quietly. Porter materialized on the other flank. Winchester trained on the second guard. "Listen to him. We've had enough killing for one day, but we'll make room for two more if you insist." The guards froze. Judge Wardell looked around, finally realizing his authority meant nothing here. He was surrounded by an angry mob of people he'd robbed, standing in a town square beside his son's cooling corpse, with no leverage and no escape. Then Henry Porter spoke, his voice carrying across the square. "Won't matter if you kill her, Your Honor. Won't matter if you burn those documents or hang every witness here, because I already made copies." Every head turned toward Porter. The old scout stood with his shoulders back, years of shame falling away as he spoke truth that mattered. "3 days ago," Porter continued, "while Bridger and the sister were riding through Hell's Canyon, I circled back, found a trading post with a clerk who could write clear, paid him $20 and spent 2 days copying every document, every deed, every map, every signature, every word of Father Donovan's journal." Judge Wardell's face drained of color. "I sent 3 riders," Porter said, his voice growing stronger. "One to Helena, carrying full copies to the territorial governor. Should arrive tomorrow morning. One to Salt Lake City to the telegraph office, with instructions to wire the details to newspapers in San Francisco, Chicago, and New York. And one directly to the Chicago Tribune offices, carrying the complete package." Porter's grin was savage and satisfied. "By now, Your Honor, your name is being printed in newspapers across the country. By Christmas, your face will be on front pages from here to Washington. Your corruption will be discussed in Congress. Federal investigators will be dispatched. And killing us won't change any of that. The truth is already loose. You can't catch it anymore." Judge Wardell swayed as if struck. His carefully constructed empire was collapsing in real time, 40 years of corruption unraveling in minutes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Deputy Boyd reappeared from wherever he'd been hiding, looking green around the edges. He stared at Jacob's body, at the judge, at the angry crowd. Then he made his choice. He pulled his badge from his coat, studied it for a long moment, and pinned it back on. "Judge Thomas Wardell," Boyd said, his voice shaking but determined. "By the authority of the people of this territory and the laws you claim to represent, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and accessory to murder." It was self-preservation masquerading as righteousness, but it worked. Boyd had read the moment and chosen to be on the side that wasn't heading for the gallows. The crowd surged forward, not violent, but inexorable. They surrounded Wardell and his guards like a tide 200 citizens, taking back power from corrupt officials who'd stolen it. The blacksmith reached out, plucked the silver watch chain from Wardell's vest. "I'll be taking this as down payment for the land you stole from my family. The rest will collect in court." Others moved in, not looting but reclaiming, taking back pieces of dignity from the man who'd robbed them of everything. Wardell was escorted toward the jail, his distinguished bearing crumbling with each step. The man who'd controlled territorial justice for 2 decades was now subject to it, and the reversal was absolute and final. Margaret stood in the center of the square, the leather pouch empty, now its precious documents distributed to the mayor and a hastily assembled citizen committee. Townspeople approached her one by one, asking if their names were in the records, asking if their lost land could be recovered, asking for hope where none had existed before. She answered every question with patience and honesty, and slowly, like storm clouds, parting hope began to replace rage. Nate found himself sitting on a bench outside the general store, suddenly exhausted. The sharps felt heavy across his knees. His hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline finally drained away. Porter sat beside him, pulling out his flask. They passed it back and forth in silence, watching the town transform, watching justice emerge from chaos. "We did it," Porter said finally. "Actually did it. We survived. That's different from winning. The judge is arrested. His son's dead. The truth is public and spreading. How is that not winning?" Nate looked at the courthouse, at the crowd gathering around Margaret, at the jail where corrupt officials now occupied cells meant for honest men accused of imaginary crimes, at Jacob's body being carried away by townspeople who'd never known him. "Because Sarah's still dead," Nate said quietly. "Little Elk's still dead. Father Donovan's still dead. Winning doesn't bring them back." Porter was silent for a long moment. Then no, but maybe it means they didn't die for nothing. Maybe the next Sarah, the next little Elk, they get to grow up on land their families own legally. Maybe that's the best winning looks like in a world like this. Nate took another pull from the flask. The whiskey burned going down, warming him from the inside. Margaret approached, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes still bright. She'd been standing and speaking for hours in the brutal cold, and it showed in her shaking hands, in the blue tinge to her lips. "You should get inside," Nate said. "Get warm." "In a moment. I wanted to thank you both first. I couldn't have done this without you." "You did the hard part," Nate replied, standing up there speaking truth when bullets were flying. "That took more courage than anything we did. Courage is just fear with purpose. A Salish elder taught me that. The brave aren't those who feel no fear, but those who act despite it." Porter stood stretching his back. "I need to check on the horses. Make sure they're settled for the night. We'll be here a few days at least while this gets sorted." He walked away, leaving Nate and Margaret alone on the bench. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked. "When this is finished?" Nate considered the question. His cabin was burned. His old life was ashes. Jacob was dead. That chapter closed forever. He had no obligations, no ties, nothing holding him to any particular piece of ground, except maybe one thing. "I need to bury Jacob first," he said. "Bury him next to little Elk and Sarah. Seems fitting somehow. The man who helped kill them lying in the same earth for eternity. And after that, after..." Nate looked at her, this woman who'd turned faith into a weapon against injustice, who'd stood against grizzlies and judges with equal courage. "After, maybe I'll come find you at St. Catherine's Mission. You mentioned that in needing teachers, people who know how to survive and how to stand. I might fit that description." Margaret's smile was tired but genuine. "The offer stands, Mr. Bridger, for as long as you need it to." The next week blurred together. An emergency territorial hearing was convened in Bannock, presiding judge brought in from Virginia City to avoid any appearance of local corruption. Porter's copies were authenticated by 3 independent surveyors who swore the documents were accurate reproductions. Testimony came from dozens of sources: Salish tribal elders, evicted settler families, railroad workers who'd witnessed the fraud firsthand but been too afraid to speak, former territorial employees who'd seen the bribes change hands. The evidence was overwhelming. Judge Thomas Wardell was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He aged a decade in that courtroom, watching his legacy crumble to dust. Bishop Clarence Moore was removed from his position and faced separate criminal charges. The diocese issued a formal apology and pledged to make restitution to affected families. Harrison Grant and two other railroad executives were fined a combined $2 million and ordered to return all fraudulently obtained land. Northern Pacific Railroad's expansion through Montana was halted pending federal investigation. 6 additional territorial judges were disbarred and imprisoned. 12 senators and territorial representatives resigned rather than face prosecution. Most importantly, the land was restored. 37 families received legal title to their original properties. St. Catherine's Mission was granted a 5,000-acre endowment to ensure its continued operation. Father Donovan was honored with a marble headstone in Bannock's Cemetery. The inscription read, Father Patrick Donovan, 1821 to 1878. He died so truth could live. Nate buried Jacob Wardell in a small plot near where his cabin had stood. No marker, no ceremony, just a hole in the frozen ground and the weight of complicated history. He stood over the grave for a long time trying to find words. Finally, he spoke to the silent earth. You were right that loving her put her in danger, but you were wrong that running from love was the answer. I'm done running, Jacob. I'm done hiding. A man holds ground or loses soul, and I'm finding new ground worth holding. Snow began to fall soft and steady, covering the fresh-turned earth and the ashes of the burned cabin. Covering the past, Nate turned and walked back to his horse without looking back. 3 weeks later, he rode into St. Catherine's Mission in Ruby Valley. The place was larger than he'd expected, a cluster of log buildings centered around a stone chapel. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Children's voices carried across the snow, speaking both English and Salish in mixed conversation. Margaret met him at the mission gate. She wore a clean habit now properly fitted with a fresh white coif covering her hair, but her eyes were the same. Gray and fierce and uncompromising. You came, she said. I did. Still need a teacher. Desperately. We have 50 children, mixed Salish and settler heritage. They speak 3 languages between them and have more energy than a spring grizzly. Think you can handle them? I raised one daughter for 2 years. She seemed to think I was doing fine. Maybe I can try again with better odds this time. Margaret's expression softened. She'd be proud of you, I think. Little Elk and Sarah both. Proud that you're choosing to build instead of mourn. Maybe, or maybe they're just glad I finally stopped feeling sorry for myself and started living again. Margaret led him into the mission compound. Children ran up immediately, curious about the stranger. Nate found himself surrounded by small faces, brown and white, and everything between, all chattering questions in multiple languages. This is Mr. Bridger, Margaret announced. He'll be teaching you how to track animals, how to survive in the mountains, and how to stand up when standing costs something. A little Salish girl, maybe 6 years old, grabbed his hand. Will you tell us stories about the mountains? Nate looked down at her, at the trust in her eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been frozen for 8 years beginning to thaw. Yeah, he said, I can tell you stories. The years passed. Nate became a fixture at St. Catherine's Mission, teaching survival skills and mountain wisdom to generations of children. He built a small cabin on the mission grounds, simple but solid, learned more Salish, helped Margaret navigate the complex legal battles over restored land rights. The mission grew. What had been a small outpost became a thriving community, a bridge between cultures. Salish families who'd been driven away returned. Settler families who'd lost everything found new starts. Children who might have grown up separated by race and suspicion instead grew up as neighbors and friends. Nate never remarried. The ghosts of Little Elk and Sarah stayed with him, but they felt different now. Less like chains, more like companions. Reminders of what he'd loved and why it mattered to keep loving. Margaret remained Mother Superior of the mission for 38 years. She became a fierce advocate for indigenous rights, testifying before Congress, writing letters to newspapers, never backing down from fights that needed fighting. And through it all, she and Nate held their ground. The ground that mattered. In the spring of 1918, 40 years after their desperate flight through Hell's Canyon, Nathaniel Bridger stood in the mission cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley. He was 76 years old now, white-haired and weathered, but still straight-backed, still standing. 3 graves lay before him, marked with simple stone markers. Little Elk Bridger, 1848 to 1873. Beloved wife. Sarah Bridger, 1871 to 1873. Our joy. Sister Margaret Brennan, 1853 to 1917. She held ground. Margaret had died the previous winter, pneumonia taking her quickly at age 64. Her last words to Nate had been, "Keep teaching them to stand. That's how truth survives." Nate didn't cry, he'd done his crying already. Instead, he placed wildflowers on each grave and stood in silence, remembering. Behind him, St. Catherine's Mission sprawled across the valley. The original buildings had been expanded, improved. Now there was a stone chapel with stained glass windows, a proper school building that held 100 students, a medical clinic, workshops teaching carpentry and weaving and agriculture. Smoke rose from 24 chimneys. Children played in the yards, mixed groups of Salish and settler kids who spoke each other's languages and shared each other's games without thinking twice about it. This was the ground they'd held. This was what truth looked like when it survived. Footsteps approached from behind. Nate didn't turn around. He knew the tread. "Mr. Bridger?" Joseph Little Elk's voice was respectful. He was 28 now, son of Little Elk's younger sister, raised at the mission. He managed the mission's landholdings, ensuring the deeds stayed protected and proper. "Joseph, telegram from the territorial governor. He wants to honor you and Mother Margaret at a ceremony in Helena next month for your work establishing the mission and protecting indigenous land rights." Nate shook his head slightly. "Tell him we're too busy." Joseph smiled. He'd expected that answer. "I'll send your regrets." Another set of footsteps, heavier and uneven. Henry Porter, 70s out of 2 now and limping from old war wounds and older guilt. He'd stayed at the mission too, working as groundskeeper, finding his redemption in service. "You gonna tell the boy?" Porter asked quietly. Nate knew what he meant. Thaddeus, his grandson, was leaving tomorrow morning for the train to France. The Great War was still grinding on, still swallowing young men. Already told him everything. Last night on the porch, told him about Little Elk and Sarah, about Jacob and the judge, about Hell's Canyon and Margaret standing on those courthouse steps. All of it. And he's thinking, deciding what ground he wants to hold. They stood together in silence, 3 old men who'd chosen hard ground and paid the cost and somehow survived to see what grew from blood-soaked earth. A little girl's voice called from down the hill. "Papa Bear, are you coming? It's almost time for lessons." The nickname made Nate smile. Sarah had called him that 45 years ago. Now the mission children used it, passing it down like a tradition. "Coming," he called back. He turned from the graves, walking down the hill toward the mission. Porter walked beside him, and Joseph Little Elk, 3 generations bound together by choices made long ago. That evening, Nate sat with his grandson on the cabin porch one final time. The sun set behind the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Grandpa," Thaddeus said, "I've been thinking about your story, about everything you told me. And you said a man holds ground or loses soul. I'm trying to figure out what ground I should hold. The army says we're fighting for freedom in France. But is that my ground? Or should my ground be here protecting this place you and Mother Margaret built?" Nate looked out at the mission, at the land they'd fought to save, at the children who represented a future built on truth instead of lies. "Can't tell you what ground to hold, boy. That's a choice every man has to make for himself. But I'll say this." He turned to face his grandson directly. "Ground isn't just dirt and borders. It's what you stand for, what you're willing to bleed for, what you pass down to those who come after." "But how do I know which ground is worth it?" You listen to that voice inside that tells you when something's wrong. The voice Margaret listened to when she ran from St. Catherine's with those documents. The voice I listened to when I cut her down from that tree instead of riding on. It's the same voice your father listened to when he married your mother despite her family's objections. The voice that says, "This matters. This is worth the cost." Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I think I need to go to France. I think that's my ground right now. Men are dying there and maybe I can help. But when I come back, when you come back, I'm coming back here, to this land, to help run the mission, to teach my own children someday what you taught me. That's the ground I'll hold after the war." Nate felt something warm spread through his chest. Then you learn the lesson. A man holds ground or loses soul. You know which ground matters. They sat together as darkness fell. Grandfather and grandson, past and future linked by choices and blood, in the understanding that some things were worth fighting for. The next morning, Nate walked Thaddeus to the wagon that would take him to the train station. The boy's duffel bag sat in the wagon bed. His mother and father had already said their goodbyes, too emotional to watch him leave. "You be careful over there," Nate said. "Come back whole if you can." "I will, Grandpa, and when I do, you can teach me everything else. All the stories you haven't told yet." They embraced quick and hard the way men do when words feel insufficient. Thaddeus climbed into the wagon. As it pulled away, he looked back once, raising his hand. Nate raised his in return. The wagon disappeared down the road. Nate stood watching long after it was gone, remembering another goodbye, another departure. Little Elk leaving to visit her mother's family. Sarah waving from her mother's arms. But this time felt different. This time felt like beginning instead of ending. He turned back toward the mission. The bell was ringing, calling children to morning lessons. Smoke rose from chimneys into the clear spring air. The Bitterroot Mountains stood eternal and unchanging in the distance. Henry Porter emerged from the barn, leading a horse that needed shoeing. Joseph Little Elk was working in the vegetable garden, preparing soil for spring planting. A group of children ran past laughing, speaking Salish and English in the same sentence without noticing the switch. This was the ground they'd held. This was what 40 years of standing looked like. Nate walked toward the school building where 50 students waited for lessons about tracking and survival and knowing which battles mattered. He moved slower than he had at 36, but his spine was still straight, his purpose still clear. A young Salish girl ran up, grabbing his hand. "Papa Bear, will you tell us the story about the grizzly and the nun?" "After lessons," Nate said, smiling. "Always after lessons." They walked together toward the schoolhouse. Behind them, the mission bell continued to ring, the sound carrying across the valley, reaching toward the mountains. A man holds ground or loses soul. Nate had held his ground, and in holding it, he'd found his soul again. The story was finished, but the legacy would continue. In the children he taught, in the land that had been restored, in the truth that had survived because people chose to speak it when silence would have been safer. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the earth. Spring had come to Montana, and the mission that had been born in blood and desperation 40 years ago stood strong, a testament to the simple truth that some ground is worth defending, that some battles are worth fighting, that courage matters more than comfort, and that sometimes the hardest ground to hold is the ground beneath your own feet when the whole world tells you to run. Nathaniel Burridge had stopped running, had planted himself and refused to move, and from that choice a forest had grown. He stood in the schoolhouse doorway, looking out at the valley, at the mountains beyond, at the wide Montana sky that held all the promise of spring. "Thank you," he said quietly to the ghosts that walked with him, to Little Elk and Sarah and Margaret, to all those who'd stood when standing cost everything. Then he turned to face his students, 50 young faces waiting to learn how to survive in the wilderness and in the world, how to track animals and read weather, how to know when to fight and when to walk away, and most importantly, how to hold ground when their souls depended on it. The lesson began.